Anne, and I'm hosting this installment where we're discussing the 13th chapter of the second book of Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. In this chapter, St. John tells us how to discern the proper time to stop using the imagination during prayer and meditation. As we discussed in the last chapter, these things are necessary for beginners, so we don't want to lay them aside before the appropriate time.
Before it's time.
The imagination, which involves the senses, isn't a proximate means to the divine, but it nevertheless a remote means for beginners. For beginners, its use helps to establish a prayerful and spiritual discipline and regimen. There are 3 signs that we need to look for before laying aside the imagination. The first sign is that we find that we don't seem to have much pleasure when we meditate, pray, or think about sacred things while we use our imagination. Earlier in our journeys, we might have found sweetness and a sense of well-being when we did this, but now it seems a bit arid. We can compare this to playing with toy soldiers or dolls when we were children. Maybe we played with them every day as a child, but we grew older and suddenly it didn't seem like any fun at all. However, as long as you find sweetness in using the imagination in meditation and prayer, you should not abandon imagination.
Some things can't be rushed.
The second sign is that we realize that while we pray and meditate, we don't have a desire to fix our attention on particular objects or entities. We no longer have much pleasure in this. The third and surest sign is when we enjoy being alone in silence, and we realize that we're already waiting with loving attentiveness for God. We realize that in our silence we are finding peace, quiet, and restfulness without acts and exercises of the intellectual faculties. In this state, the soul is alone, with an attentiveness and a general and loving knowledge, but without any particular understanding of the process. St. John cautions us that we should experience all 3 signs together before we abandon our imagination during meditation and prayer. Just having one sign isn't enough by itself. We need to have all 3.
It'd be ridiculous if you didn't.
For example, a person might not be able to meditate and pray using the imagination, but he doesn't have the other signs. However, the inability to use the imagination might be because there is some sort of distraction in his life, or it might be that he lacks discipline. To give up the imagination at that point might lead only to rambling thoughts, more dryness, and perhaps even abandoning prayer and meditation outright. Another example is a person who has an inability to fix his imagination upon specific supernatural things, but doesn't have the other signs. It could be that the person's soul just wants to fix its imagination on different supernatural things. In this case, the person shouldn't be abandoning the use of imagination. Instead, he should be less rigid with his prayer regimen. In a case like this, it would be very helpful to have a good and qualified spiritual director.
I recommend it.
One more example would be a person who has difficulty concentrating on supernatural things. However, it might be that the person is going through a bout of depression or some other imbalance. This person isn't ready to abandon the use of imagination because he doesn't have the third sign, which is the desire to wait in loving and silent attentiveness for God. The process of putting aside our imagination is a gradual one, and we may not even notice it when we start to do this.
It sort of happens, you know.
St. John tells us that this is because entering into the next stage is likely to be subtle and delicate and almost imperceptible to the senses. All of our lives, our souls have been accustomed to prayer and meditation, imagining things from the senses. This has always been perceptible because it involves things we can see or imagine. When we shift away from this, it is somewhat imperceptible because there aren't any new images taking the place of the old ones. The new condition is spiritual. The change is especially imperceptible because we won't fully understand it. Remember, we are no longer relying on the intellectual faculty of understanding. Instead, we are traveling by the virtue of faith. When we started the purging ourselves of things of the senses with the first book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, we probably did so mostly as a discipline. We were depriving ourselves of the things that are senses and offering up the deprivations as a sacrifice to God. However, in time, we may have discovered that we have no desire to watch television, listen to the radio, play video games, listen to music, or even watch YouTube. Now perhaps it only seems like a bunch of distracting noise. Perhaps we prefer silence. Perhaps now, when we are going for long drives, we have no desire to listen to the radio or CDs, and we enjoy the silence. This demonstrates how Book 1 prepared us for Book 2. The more accustomed the soul grows to allowing itself to rest, the more it will grow. As the soul grows, the more conscious it will become of the loving general knowledge of God. From this, the soul will have greater enjoyment than in anything else, since this loving, general knowledge causes its peace, rest, pleasure, and delight without any labor or effort. Please note, however, that St. John isn't saying that the imagination won't come or go. It will always do so to an extent. I hope you have enjoyed this installment of Ascent of Mount Carmel. We'll be back again next week. In the meantime, please pray for the church.